The prosecutor expected resistance. Instead, the veteran reached into her jacket and slid a folded photograph across the stand. The judge's expression shifted as he recognized the facesman officially listed as lost in training, not combat. But it was the faint shadow echo insignia in the corner that unsettled him most. That unit, according to every record, had never existed. Her voice was quiet but clear. They deserve more than lies. What happens when one witness forces the military to rewrite its history? In this story, you'll see how a single emblem can unravel decades of official denials and bring hidden service into the light. For years, she carried the truth alone until this moment changed everything. Isolation defined the years between Thalia Voss and the world around her. She kept her medals locked away, the ribbons deliberately mismounted, a silent code only she understood. Officially, she was a logistics coordinator at Ramstein Air Base from 1998 to 2003. The reality was buried under layers of classification, invisible to those closest to her. At home, she moved through familiar routines, but the distance between her and her family widened with each secret she was forced to keep. Her husband never pressed about the scars that didn't fit the car accident story. Their daughter grew up believing her mother's work was paperwork in secure offices overseas. Voss learned to answer questions with half-truths, always careful, always measured. When the nightmares returned, she would sit awake in the dark, listening to the quiet house, unable to explain the weight pressing on her chest. Conversations with other veterans were an exercise in restraint. At the VFW, she listened to stories about firefights and convoys, nodding politely, sipping her drink. Their memories were at least acknowledged, even if painful. Hers existed only in the gaps between what was said and what was left, out the operations with no names, the faces she saw only in her dreams, the insignia she kept hidden in the lining of her jacket. Therapists at the VA could only guess at the source of her anxiety. Intake forms asked about combat exposure. She checked no every time. She couldn't describe the real reasons for her insomnia, or the moments she startled at sudden noises. The official narrative left no room for her truth, and so she carried it alone. The silence was supposed to protect national security, but it became a shield for something else, a fiction that let others avoid uncomfortable questions. The moment that shifted, everything was subtle. At a family gathering, a retired Marine watched her as she answered the usual question about where she'd served. He studied her posture, how her eyes tracked the exits. His quiet, "You don't have to say," was less accusation than recognition. That look told her she wasn't as invisible as she thought. That night she unlocked the box under her bed and took out the photograph she'd risked everything to keep. The image, worn from years of handling, showed 7 people standing by a vehicle with Bulgarian plates. Most would see nothing unusual, but the shadow echo insignia in the corner, nearly faded, told another story. One of the men had been declared dead in a training accident 3 weeks after the photo was taken. The details didn't match the official reports. Voss began to write not just names and dates, but the pieces that made up the truth. She mapped out what she would need to say if someone finally listened. The blue coffee mug stayed in the cupboard as she prepared for the questions that would follow her into the windowless rooms where official records never reached. In the official record, Operation Shadowfall never happened. The mission wasn't listed in any deployment logs, and the unit involved Shadow Echo didn't exist on paper. The team assembled in a featureless room at a base that denied its own location, handed instructions that never mentioned Kazara by name. They received no identifying patches, only a faint insignia stitched inside one jacket, a detail meant to be overlooked but impossible to forget. The objective was clear: extract an intelligence asset with information on Russian arms shipments. Meridian Defense, a private contractor, was brought in for perimeter security, a phrase that would later mean something very different. The plan unraveled almost immediately. Instead of holding the outskirts, Meridian's personnel swept through the village, engaging anyone they deemed a threat. Civilian homes were hit. The asset vanished before contact could be made. Afterward, Meridian's after-action report cited insurgent aggression and justified their actions as necessary for team safety. But thermal imagery from the night told a different story. Buildings, marked as empty, still showed heat signatures, movement where there shouldn't have been any. Witnesses described children with burns, injuries not consistent with small arms fire. A medic's log noted wounds that matched white phosphorus exposure, a substance officially absent from the mission inventory. That page disappeared from digital records, but a photo of bandage wrappers survived, the codes linking them to Department of Defense contractors. The cover-up deepened with manipulated documentation. Satellite images submitted as evidence showed clear skies, yet every operator recalled the rain mud clinging to boots, water pooling in the vehicle tracks. The timestamps on those images didn't match the timeline of the operation. In court, Meridian's attorneys insisted the images proved no humanitarian teams were present, but Voss pointed out the digital artifacts and inconsistencies. The official narrative was carefully constructed, each detail designed to erase what actually happened. Most of the team's documentation was destroyed per protocol. One encrypted thumb drive slipped through, concealed in a pen, surfacing only years later when it became evidence in an unrelated investigation. Its contents fragments of helmet camera footage, a whispered, "Not our orders," and a flash of the Shadow Echo insignia contradicted the official version. The government classified the footage as a training exercise in Nevada, but the terrain and voices told another story. What remained for those involved were gaps. A psychiatrist's note about recurring nightmares, an insurance claim for a vehicle riddled with bullet holes, a birthday card referencing that cold place with the bad coffee. These fragments never made it into the record, but they shaped the lives of everyone who returned. The operation's silence extended far beyond the mission, seeping into every relationship, every attempt at normalcy. The cost of silence for Thalia Voss was measured in forms denied, treatments withheld, and the steady erosion of trust in the world around her. Her official file, stamped and signed, listed her as a non-combatant support staff, safely distant from anything that might warrant danger pay or special consideration. When she first applied for disability through the VA, the intake clinician noted her exaggerated startle response, but circled no confirmed combat exposure. The paperwork moved through the system without urgency. Months passed before the rejection letter arrived, citing insufficient documentation and lack of evidence for any service-related condition. The injustice was sharpened by the knowledge that every detail that could have proved her claim was locked away behind security clearance levels she no longer held. She tried again, this time with medical records showing chemical burns on her hands. The response came in the form of a letter marked with a classification warning, to be opened only in a secure facility. When she pressed further, a meeting was arranged not in an office, but in a parking garage in Arlington. The man waiting for her wore civilian clothes, his badge visible only for a moment. He advised her to consider early retirement, to let the matter drop. There was no threat, just the quiet suggestion that some questions were better left unasked. She left with nothing but a sense of finality. The message was clear. The system was not designed to help those whose service was never meant to be acknowledged. At home, the effects of secrecy grew heavier. Her husband learned not to ask about the medical bills with redacted provider names. When their daughter's therapist inquired about family trauma, Thalia hesitated before checking no for military exposure. There was no way to explain the truth. She burned her old deployment notes in the backyard, watching the Cyrillic script disappear in the flames. Even among other veterans, she felt the distance widen. Stories could be shared, but hers always had to be edited, scrubbed of anything real. Attempts to seek help through official channels led nowhere. A senator's liaison stopped returning calls after reviewing her records. A veteran service officer closed her file at the first sign of classification stamps. Even at the American Legion, the mention of Kazara drew averted eyes and quiet warnings. The message was consistent at every turn. Her story did not fit the categories the system recognized. The consequences extended beyond her own health. 4 of her former team members were gone, 2 to accidents, 1 to a drug overdose, another simply vanished. The survivors changed their names and disappeared from public view, contact reduced to coded messages and the occasional unsigned card. Isolation became routine, not just for her but for anyone who had carried the same burden. What remained was a growing resolve. If the system refused to acknowledge her service, she would document its failures instead. She gathered pharmacy receipts for medications prescribed under unspecified anxiety, photographs of her injuries, and the coordinates of places she was ordered to forget. The last letter from the VA arrived 6 weeks before the trial, its language as impersonal as ever. She filed it away, alongside the photograph that would soon demand a different kind of attention. She began to consider what she could risk and what she could keep, as she prepared for the day when the truth would need to be shown rather than told. Among the few things Thalia Voss allowed herself to keep, the most significant were the pieces of evidence she preserved in defiance of military regulations. She understood the risks. Classified operations demanded silence, and personal documentation was strictly prohibited. But for her, preserving proof was more than self-protection. It was a responsibility to those who couldn't come forward themselves. She relied on methods that blended in with everyday life. Rather than using any military-issued camera, she purchased disposable ones from shops during layovers, always careful to avoid a digital trail. The photographs she took seemed ordinary at first glance: crowded market scenes, dusty roads, people in civilian clothes. Yet the details mattered. A street sign in the background, a date on a local newspaper, a hotel keycard tucked into the corner of the frame. These subtle inclusions contradicted the official timeline and locations, quietly documenting the places her team had been ordered to forget. The most important photograph was the one she kept folded inside a battered copy of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It showed a melon vendor on a street near the Kazara extraction point. The vendor's cart stood exactly where, weeks later, satellite images would reveal scorch marks, evidence of an incident the official reports denied. The date stamp on the photo matched the operation's true timeline, and the vendor's face later appeared in UN refugee records, bearing injuries consistent with white phosphorus exposure. The image was plain, but it carried the weight of everything omitted from the official record. Voss took care to ensure the photograph's authenticity could not be dismissed. She developed the film at a series of different locations, always paying cash, never using a name. She annotated the back with cross-references to mission logs and public satellite imagery, drawing a line between what was denied and what could be proven. The photo was not the most sensational piece of evidence she possessed, but it was the most difficult to refute. In preparing for her testimony, she kept the photograph concealed until the right moment. She wore the same jacket she had during the operation, the faint shadow echo insignia stitched inside the lining. It was a calculated choice. She knew the insignia would draw attention if discovered, but she waited, letting the prosecution establish her as just another aid worker, someone unremarkable. Only when pressed did she produce the photograph, sliding it across the stand without a word. Judge Harmon's reaction was immediate. He leaned forward, examining the image, his confusion growing as he traced the details. The insignia, the date, the faces, none of it fit the narrative Meridian's attorneys had constructed. In that instant, the courtroom's focus shifted. The evidence she carried had done what years of silence could not. It demanded an answer. Her approach was measured, careful, and rooted in the knowledge that the truth alone would not be enough without proof. Every decision she made, how she preserved the evidence, when she revealed it, what she risked, was shaped by the understanding that the opportunity to speak openly would come only once. The path to that moment had required patience and precision, but it had also required the right setting. Voss selected the Meridian defense trial with care, knowing that everything, location, judge, and the defense's tactics would work in her favor. The D.C. Federal courthouse's secure facilities allowed classified matters to be discussed without delay. Judge Harmon's background as a JAG officer meant he would recognize details others might miss, especially the insignia she carried. Meridian's legal team, known for their aggressive cross-examinations, would inevitably push her to the point where credentials mattered most. Her preparations began months before the trial. A single meeting with a trusted former JAG officer outlined the path forward. If the court acknowledged her unit's existence, even indirectly, it would force open the door to her testimony. That single procedural loophole became the cornerstone of her entire approach. Voss's strategy focused on authentication, not admission. She never announced her classified service. Instead, she let the evidence carefully preserved and subtly introduced force the issue. The photograph of the melon vendor was more than proof. It was a test for the system itself. Either the Department of Defense would have to admit the photo's authenticity, confirming her presence, or disavow it and reveal inconsistencies in their own records. She structured her testimony to create that dilemma. Every detail in her appearance was calculated. The navy blazer concealed the Shadow Echo insignia. Her slacks hid an old injury, one that never appeared in official U.S. medical files but was documented elsewhere. Even her hair was pulled back to reveal a scar that didn't match any stateside incident. Each omission and every visible mark worked together to prompt questions the defense wasn't prepared to answer. When Meridian's attorneys demanded proof of her background, she produced a heavily redacted DD-214. The gaps, missing stamps, unexplained absences were obvious to anyone familiar with military paperwork. Judge Harmon's eyes lingered on the form, noting the irregularities. The defense pressed, but each request for clarification only highlighted what had been omitted. Testimony from a former Meridian medic, granted immunity, added weight. He described treating wounds with symptoms consistent with chemical exposure, then referenced the lieutenant, a nod to Voss. The defense cut off the line of questioning, but the implication was already set before the jury. All these moves were aimed at one moment when the judge would have no choice but to acknowledge her unit. Voss waited for the right time, letting the courtroom dynamics build. She knew that the defense's denials, the subtle tells in Judge Harmon's reactions, and the mounting contradictions would lead to a single, decisive point. As the trial reached its turning point, the judge instructed her to remove her jacket, following standard procedure for witnesses. The next few seconds would make clear what years of silence and planning had set in motion. When Thalia Voss stood and slipped off her jacket, the action looked routine, just another procedural step in a federal trial. But as the fabric fell away, a patch became visible above her left breast. A simple circular insignia with a stylized compass rose, and the initials ODS-7. The colors were muted but unmistakable. The emblem belonged to Operational Detachment Sierra 7, a unit officially deactivated and erased from existence more than 2 decades ago. Its presence in a civilian courtroom was not just unexpected, it was impossible by every official account. A ripple of silence swept through the room. The court reporter's hands hovered, unmoving, above her keys. The bailiff at the jury box stiffened, and then caught himself, eyes darting to the judge. 2 Pentagon observers, there under the guise of monitoring a contractor dispute, exchanged a look that said more than any words. One quietly reached into his suit jacket, revealing a badge with 3 letters CIA before tucking it away. Even the Meridian defense executive in the gallery, usually unflappable, leaned in close to his attorney, face drawn and pale. Judge Harmon's reaction was measured but unmistakable. He removed his glasses, eyes fixed on the insignia, and spoke so softly the microphones barely picked it up. The court reporter, later reviewing the audio, confirmed the words, "That's not possible." For a moment, the trial's focus shifted entirely. The case was no longer about Meridian's conduct in Kazarite, was about the witness herself and the classified world she represented. The defense attorney, Harrison Westlake, tried to recover. His objection, "Your Honor, we must question." The relevance of this display came out strained. He understood instantly what the insignia meant. Meridian's entire defense rested on the assertion that no sanctioned U.S. operations had ever taken place in Kazara. Now, with a single emblem, that argument collapsed. The presence of Sierra 7's insignia forced the court to acknowledge what had been denied in every official statement. The judge's gaze lingered on Voss. He recognized the stakes. The Pentagon observers did not move, but their silence filled the space between every breath in the room. Security-cleared personnel rarely revealed themselves, but here, their presence underscored that this was no ordinary witness and no ordinary testimony. A request for recess came quickly from the defense, but Judge Harmon denied it. The courtroom remained still, every eye drawn to Voss and the emblem that had upended years of secrecy. She reached into her pocket, withdrawing a folded photograph, the image of the Kazaran marketplace, time-stamped and annotated. She placed it on the stand, sliding it toward the defense table. "You asked for my credentials," she said, voice steady. "Here they are." The man third from the left in the photograph was Meridian's chief operations officer, his younger face unmistakable beside the vendor's cart. The defense attorney faltered, unable to object. The judge's eyes flicked from the photograph to the insignia and back, the implications settling over the court. For a long moment, no one spoke. The realization of what had just occurred settled into the room. Official history had shifted, not with a confession, but with a single, undeniable symbol. The air felt charged, every movement deliberate, as if the entire courtroom waited for permission to breathe again. In that silence, Voss's hands remained steady on the witness stand, the weight of years of secrecy and risk pressing down. The recognition in Judge Harmon's eyes marked the beginning of something irreversible, and for the first time, the cost of carrying the truth showed in the way her fingers curled tightly against the wood. Relief came first, sharp and unmistakable. As soon as the judge recognized the insignia, the pressure she'd carried for years dropped away. It was a physical sensation, her shoulders easing, her breath returning in a rush she hadn't expected. For the first time since her service began, she was not required to hide or minimize what she'd done. The relief was not just emotional. It was as if her body, finally released from the constant tension of secrecy, had to relearn how to move. She became aware of muscles unclenching, of a space inside her chest she hadn't known was tight. The act of truth-telling, so long deferred, brought a strange, weightless clarity. Grief followed close behind. It struck her not as a single blow, but as a slow rising ache that made the edges of the courtroom blur. Her gaze lingered on the photograph she'd placed before the judge, seeing not just evidence, but the faces of people who would never have a chance to speak for themselves. Each name and memory surfaced: teammates lost, civilians harmed, the years of birthdays and milestones missed, because her real story could never be told. The acknowledgement of her service brought with it the sharp realization of everything that had been lost or left unspoken. She felt the weight of those absences, the cost of a truth kept hidden for so long that it had reshaped the very fabric of her life. Anger came last, steady and cold. It was not the kind that flared out in words or gestures, but the kind that settled deep and refused to fade. Sitting on the witness stand, she pressed the photograph flat, her movements precise. The anger was not only for herself, but for everyone forced into silence by a system that protected its own narrative at the expense of those who served it. She remembered the years of denied claims, the medical appointments where she could not answer honestly, the moments when her family asked questions she could never fully explain. The system's refusal to acknowledge her reality had not just hurt Harriet, had erased the sacrifices of an entire group. That knowledge simmered beneath the surface, shaping her resolve as she faced the court. In the days that followed, the emotional impact lingered. Each interaction, whether with her family, the VA, or even strangers, felt subtly changed. She found herself hesitating less, no longer measuring every word for classified details. The physical symptoms of stress faded in increments. Her hands steadied, her sleep deepened, and the ever-present ache between her shoulders began to recede. Yet relief and grief remained intertwined, the knowledge of what had been gained balanced against what could never be recovered. But the public acknowledgement of her service did not bring only resolution. As news of the trial spread, she sensed a shift in the unease that hinted at consequences she could not yet see. The system she had challenged was not built to reward those who broke its silence. Even as she tried to adjust to a new sense of freedom, the first signs of institutional resistance began to appear, subtle but unmistakable, before the courtroom had even emptied. The bureaucratic backlash arrived with practiced efficiency. As the courtroom settled after her testimony, officials moved quickly to regain control. Two men in civilian suits approached Voss, credentials flashing. They requested an immediate debrief, citing national security. She had anticipated this maneuver and responded with a signal to her legal observer, who immediately filed a motion under Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 15. Judge Harmon approved it on the spot, sealing her testimony and ensuring any statements made in the debrief would be preserved in the official record. The attempt to isolate her had instead forced the system to acknowledge her account in a way that could not be quietly erased. Retaliation came in quieter, more persistent forms. Her VA psychiatrist, who had treated her for years and understood the context of her symptoms, was suddenly reassigned out of state. No explanation was given, and her replacement arrived with no access to her previous notes. The transition left gaps in her medical documentation, undermining her ongoing disability claim. At the same time, she received notice from the National Personnel Records Center that her official service file had been updated. Several deployment dates now matched the sanitized version Meridian's attorneys had presented in court. The discrepancies were subtle, but significant enough to cast doubt on her testimony if left unchallenged. Voss had prepared for this. She kept photocopies of her psychiatrist's unsigned clinical notes, documenting the progression of her symptoms and linking them to specific deployments. For the altered service records, she produced a carbon copy of her original SF-180 request, complete with timestamps and the NPRC's own receipt. These measures, taken months before the trial, allowed her to counter each bureaucratic maneuver with verifiable evidence. The official response escalated as Meridian's lawyers filed a motion accusing her of fabricating evidence. They claimed the insignia was a replica and the photographs digitally manipulated. The Pentagon refused to authenticate either, citing operational sensitivities. The contradiction was obvious. To disprove her, they would have to admit knowledge of the unit. Reporters began to notice the gaps, and the story gained traction outside the courthouse. Allies emerged in unexpected places. General Camden Riker, retired, spoke publicly in her defense, describing her as one of the finest officers he'd known and warning that her claims about Meridian should be taken seriously. Major Quillen, a former Shadow Echo operator, provided corroborating evidence satellite imagery and communications logs deliberately redacted but unmistakably real. Their support did not come without risk. The DLA analyst who leaked munitions records faced an administrative review. The Master Chief who shared fleet movement orders endured a prolonged audit of his benefits. Still, their willingness to speak out formed a loose network of verification outside official channels. The Department of Defense and Justice pushed for the trial's termination on national security grounds, but Judge Harmon denied their request. The defense shifted tactics, focusing on technicalities of command authority and chain of custody. Congressional staffers quietly requested her dental records to confirm deployment locations, only to find files flagged with red warnings by complicit clerks. The resistance was coordinated, persistent, and designed to wear her down. Despite these efforts, the evidence and support she had gathered proved resilient. The bureaucracy continued to fight, but cracks had begun to show. The weight of official denial could not erase the records she had preserved, nor the testimony now sealed in the court's files. As the months passed, she received a letter from the VA, indicating her disability rating might be adjusted downward based on new evidence. The implication was clear: the system would continue to resist, even as pieces of the truth slipped through. Yet something had shifted. For the first time in years, the possibility of recognition, however, partial or belated, seemed within reach. Validation arrived in the form of paperwork and protocol. The VA retroactively approved her disability benefits, backdating them to the year her untreated injuries first appeared in her medical records. The check from the Treasury covered over a decade of denied claims, a sum that felt abstract compared to the years lost in pain. At Walter Reed Medical Center, doctors finally documented the compression fractures and nerve damage she'd carried since her classified deployments. The new charts simply read "service-related," with no redacted lines. No one asked for explanations. The acknowledgement was silent but complete. Recognition brought a shift in her daily life. Medical care previously denied was now routine, prescriptions processed without question, physical therapy sessions scheduled without bureaucratic hurdles. The Combat Action Badge, awarded in a brief ceremony with little fanfare, represented official acceptance of what had always been true. She pinned it to her blouse, aware the moment was as much about the Army's record as her own. The award came years too late, but it closed a gap that had shaped her life in quiet, persistent ways. There was no parade, no public address, just a photograph, likely to be classified, and a nod from the colonel who handed her the badge. Yet each step toward recognition brought new challenges. The adjustment was not straightforward. The label of "Acknowledged Veteran" came with expectations she had never prepared for. Her caseworker at the VA checked in regularly, asking questions that sometimes felt like surveillance as much as support. There were new layers of scrutiny, monthly forms, updated files, and a sense that her story was being monitored as closely as it was being validated. The emotional cost lingered. The nightmares changed shape but did not disappear. The anxiety that had once centered on secrecy now shifted to the complexities of being seen. Even with medical care and compensation, the toll of years spent in silence was not easily undone. The recognition also altered her place among other veterans. Some treated her with caution, uncertain what her story meant for their own. Others, especially those from units with similar histories, offered quiet solidarity in hospital corridors or at physical therapy appointments. The language of acknowledgement was subtly nod, a shared look, a wordless understanding that the price of validation was measured in more than paperwork. Financial restitution settled in increments. Some claims processed quickly. Others dragged through appeals. The property tax exemption for disabled veterans did not apply retroactively, so she absorbed the loss. IRS forms now included boxes that reflected her status, but her accountant still urged caution. She framed her original denial letter beside the corrected certificate, a reminder of the distance between being dismissed and being believed. The final act of validation arrived in an unmarked envelope, a certificate listing her true operational history, watermarked and embossed, with a letter stating she could now discuss certain events publicly. The boundaries of what she could share remained unclear, the recognition still carrying silent restrictions. She locked the certificate away, understanding that some forms of acknowledgement would always be conditional. When asked about the cost of fighting for the truth, she offered a simple answer. She showed the scar on her wrist, the result of burning evidence in 2004. "This isn't from combat," she would say. "This is what happens when people only matter on paper." The mark remained, a permanent reminder that validation never comes without a price. In the weeks that followed, her case began to echo far beyond her own story, setting in motion changes that would touch others who had lived in the same shadows. Policy changes began quietly, but their reach was immediate. The Defense Department issued new oversight regulations for private contractors, shaped directly by what had come out in court. These became known, even in official memos, as the Voss Protocols. The protocols didn't erase the past, but they created a process for verifying classified missions without forcing veterans to break their silence. The system was imperfect layers of coded forms and indirect record checks, but it finally gave those with hidden service histories a way to access benefits and medical care that had been out of reach for years. The first to benefit was a retired Marine who had lost his eye during an extraction in Chechnya. For years, his records listed the injury as a training accident at Camp Lejeune. After the trial, the VA sent him a new decision letter. Service connection approved, based on evidence made available through the Voss protocols. The letter didn't name the operation, but the date and code matched what Thalia Voss had forced into the record. He called his wife from the parking lot, voice shaking, and read the approval out loud. An Air Force pararescueman was next. He'd spent over a decade fighting for coverage after developing neurological symptoms from chemical exposure on a mission that never officially happened. The paperwork had always stalled at the same line. No record of hazardous duty. After the policy shift, his claim was processed in 48 hours. The letter was brief, almost clinical, but the backdated coverage meant he could finally start treatment. Word spread quickly among those who had served in the shadows. Each successful case made the next one easier to file. Hundreds of other claims followed, each one a small correction to the official record. The process was still tangled in unofficial channels and workarounds. Some veterans received care through alternative funding streams, their award letters careful to avoid specifics. Appointments were sometimes rescheduled without notice, and medications occasionally arrived from unfamiliar pharmacies. The system resisted change in subtle ways, but the new regulations held. A support network grew in the margins. Veterans who had spent years hiding their service began to recognize each other in waiting rooms and hallways. An orthopedic surgeon at a VA hospital noticed scars that matched injuries described in the Meridian trial. He didn't ask questions, just adjusted the treatment plan and left a note that said, "You don't have to explain." Wordless acknowledgments became a kind of shorthand, a way to signal understanding without violating old promises. Outside the bureaucracy, Task Force Veritas formed to help others navigate the new protocols. Staffed by veterans whose cases had been resolved, the group became a point of contact for those still struggling with the aftermath of classified service. They offered guidance, legal advice, and a place to share stories that could finally be spoken, at least in part. The legal consequences for Meridian Defense sent ripples through the industry. Executives faced indictment under the War Crimes Act, and other contractors quietly updated their protocols. Congressional committees began to subpoena records once thought unreachable, and the language of official forms shifted, if only slightly, to account for the reality of non-standard deployments. Some of the most meaningful changes were less visible. At Arlington, families started placing fresh flowers on graves marked "training accident." The gesture was small, but it marked a shift, a quiet acknowledgement that the truth, once hidden, had begun to surface. In the midst of these changes, daily life pressed on, shaped by new routines and a different kind of vigilance. Living with the truth meant learning to exist in the open, while carrying memories that had always been hidden. Each morning, Thalia Voss walked to the coffee shop on the corner, the same one she'd visited before the trial, but now with a different sense of presence. She always chose the table with a clear view of both exits, her back against the wall. The staff understood her habits without needing to ask. The barista greeted her quietly, and never startled her with sudden movement, respecting the caution that had become second nature. She arranged her cup and spoon with deliberate care, the routine steadying her hands on days when sleep had been scarce. The world outside the window moved on, but for her, every small act sitting, watching, waiting became a way to anchor herself in a reality that finally acknowledged her existence. Some mornings, the weight of what she had revealed pressed in more than others. The aftermath of the trial had left her body worn, and her mind crowded with images she could not always set aside. She felt the old injuries more sharply, her left hand tightening around the mug, a faint tremor that never fully faded. The pain was a reminder of secrets kept too long, now exposed to the light. Yet there was relief, too, the knowledge that her story was no longer just a collection of hidden facts. She could walk into a room and not have to measure every word, no longer forced to invent explanations for scars or absences. The truth, once so heavy, had become a part of her daily life, woven into the details of each morning. At home, the evidence of her history remained close. In the garden beneath the rose bushes, she'd buried a waterproof case holding the original, uncensored mission photographs. The soil there stayed slightly raised, a subtle mark only she ever noticed. Sometimes, after long nights when sleep wouldn't come, she stood at the window and watched the moonlight touch that patch of earth. She thought about the lives memorialized in those images, faces, and places that no official record would ever list. The garden became a kind of private ledger, a place where truth was preserved even when the world preferred not to see it. Living with the truth was not a matter of moving past what had happened, but of carrying it forward in ways both visible and hidden. She learned to accept the mix of relief and regret, the satisfaction of recognition alongside the ache of what could never be restored. Each day, she found herself balancing what could be spoken and what still needed to remain unshared. The cost of acknowledgement lingered, but so did the quiet sense of having done what was necessary. As time went on, Voss found herself reflecting not just on her own story, but on the sacrifices made by others, whose names would never appear in any citation. The truth she had carried alone for so long now belonged, in part, to all those who had served and remained unseen. In the quiet moments between sunrise and the first sip of coffee, she wondered how many others walked through the world with their own histories hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to recognize what had been given in silence. The cost of classified service lingers long after the mission ends. Thalia's story is not unique across towns and hospitals. Veterans carry burdens that official records still refuse to name. Some walk with limps, no discharge. Summary explains, others flinch at sudden sounds, their medals tucked away in drawers. The scars of unrecognized service can outlast any battlefield injury. Take a moment to honor the silent sacrifices of veterans around you. Their stories may never appear in history books, but their impact is real. If you want to hear more stories about service and justice, subscribe for future episodes. Sometimes, all it takes is one insignia to rewrite history, and to remind us what true sacrifice looks like.